Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming. It's great to see you all here today. Happy first day of GDC. How's everyone holding up so far? Pacing yourselves? Excellent. Well, welcome. It's great to see you all here today. By the way, I can barely see anybody in the audience because the lights are super bright. But let's talk about contracting. And before we do that, though, I just want to acknowledge that probably most of you are sitting out there thinking, I really wish I could be in some other session than this one, because let's just acknowledge how much of it sucks that we're talking about contracting in the indie track of GDC, right? Because in an ideal world, we'd be making the games that we want to make, charging a fair amount for our work, and earning a decent living, doing the work that we love to do. I don't think anyone would dispute that that's the ideal, but unfortunately, this right here is our far less than ideal reality. That is the deep, dark, truthful mirror of tweets right there. So yeah, as we all know, sometimes the road to success is not quite as straightforward as we might like. And when that happens, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do to keep your team together so you can live to fight another day. And contracting is a great way to do that. But it definitely helps to know what you're doing, so that's what we're going to talk about. And hey, by the way, I'm Amy Dallas. Hi. And I run ClutchPlay Games out of Portland, Oregon, and my company just turned 7 last month, which kind of blows my mind. Thank you. Only a room full of indies can appreciate what a huge accomplishment that is. And I don't think, if I'm going to keep it real, I don't think that would have been possible without contracting, to be perfectly honest. And I think our story started out like, we're like a lot of teams out there, I think. We were once part of a corporate studio system, and the satellite office where we work got totally downsized out of existence, and we happened to live in a place where that was literally the only paying game job anywhere near where we lived. So we didn't really feel like we had a lot of options because we didn't want to leave games, so 4 of us got together and we went all in on being indie. And so we worked for 10 months without a paycheck, which I fully don't recommend, by the way. And so when we got to the end of the development cycle on that first game, we were so relieved. We were like, oh, thank God, we are so ready to make some money. So we put our game out there. We were super excited. We were full of new indie optimism. And guess what we found out? Man in co-working space. Dude knows what he's talking about, because that time around, the risk just did not pay off for us. Not at all. And thus began our journey into contracting. And I think when we started out, our goals were really simple. We just wanted to, maybe pick up 1 or 2 gigs, earn just enough money to fund the development of another game, and then hopefully, if we learned from our mistakes and we did a little better, we could go back to just being a full-time indie development team. And that's almost what happened. So we were pretty fortunate our first time out. We had a pretty good client. They paid us pretty well, and it took us about 10 months to earn enough money to start our second game, Skullduggery. And we did actually learn from our mistakes. We did a lot better on that game, and we certainly earned enough to jump back in and work on more indie games right away. And yet, when the time came, we kind of surprised ourselves by deciding that we would go back and take on some more contracting work. And at the time, we made that decision because we had some clients that we really liked who were reaching out to us and asking us for help. But also, we kind of recognized that we ended up liking it a whole lot more than we expected to, which was a surprise to us. As far as we're concerned, we get to solve really hard, interesting problems for people that we really like. And also, it gives us some predictability of income, which, as we all know as indies, is a good thing. And it's also allowed us to hire more people and pay them fairly to do work that they love to do. So it's actually been pretty good for us, but I will say as the studio head, in the beginning it was super stressful. Because I suddenly realized, man, I don't think I know everything I need to know to make sure we're successful as we take on this kind of work. So I better go do my due diligence, and go out and see what other people think who are experienced in contracting in games. And so I did that. And I basically went to all these different teams I knew and said, tell me what I need to know about contracting in games. And pretty much the messages that I got overwhelmingly was that it sucked. I heard it over and over again, all the same reasons that you all hear all the time, right? It's the indie mantra that as indies we have no power. When you're negotiating with a big company, they're the ones who have the power and you don't, so there's no room to negotiate. It's hard to get people to pay you fairly, because why would they pay an indie team fairly when they can actually pay an overseas team pennies on the dollar to do the same work. That's a thing. I just was talking to someone about that the other day. That's still a thing that people worry about a lot. And when I asked them specific questions about how people structured their projects, like, how do you do it? Do you do it as a time and materials project or a fixed bid? I heard overwhelmingly from every single person I talked to that there was only one way to do these kinds of projects, and that was as a fixed bid. And the reasons given, it was basically all the same reasons that people were saying, you know, that these kinds of projects suck. Because, again, it goes back to the idea that the clients have all the power, and a fixed bid model tends to be a little better for them, right? Because they know what they're going to get, when they're going to get it, and how much it's going to cost. And if you, as the developer, underbid the project, you're going to end up probably having to do a little bit of extra work without the extra pay. So upon hearing all this, I'm like, wow, you're right, everybody. This does sound like it sucks. This sounds terrible. Why would anyone want to do this? But at that point, again, I didn't have a lot of choices. We needed to make sure we got some money in the door. So rather than taking all the kind of negativity on board, I kind of recognized that I had a choice to make. I could either accept everything I was being told as the truth and just brace myself for my team and I to have a terrible experience, or I could focus my energies on trying to prove that it's possible to have a better experience taking on work for hire projects as an indie. And I think I've actually accomplished that over time. I've never felt like I couldn't negotiate with a client as long as I was clear about what I wanted and what I was willing to give up to get it. I've never felt like a client wouldn't pay us fairly. Like, I have to work for it. I have to push for, getting the best rate I can. But I never felt like someone was like, you're just not worth that money. And I never felt like I couldn't sell a client on a particular type of project, as long as I was clear about how it was in their best interest also, as well as mine. So that didn't happen by accident. That happened by staying really focused on what was important. And this is kind of how I maintained that level of focus. All I cared about as we were starting out was who we were, what we wanted, what was possible for us, and what tools and structures I needed to put in place to make sure we were successful. So let's start off by talking about the first item, which is the who you are part. Sorry, I totally turn into Marco Rubio when I'm giving a talk. I just get the huge dry mouth, so apologies. I'm going to be drinking some water today. So, okay. Defining your identity, I imagine a lot of you are probably sitting there thinking, I can probably skip this part. We know who our team is. We know who we are. We've worked together for a long time. And if you're tempted to think that that's the case, I just want to offer you this one potentially kind of gross-sounding piece of advice, and it is gross-sounding, but it's true. And that is this. There's a really big difference between being an indie team that makes products and an indie team that is a product. And that's essentially what you're doing. You're productizing your team and you're selling your services to a client. So to be successful at doing that, you kind of have to start looking at your team through the eyes of someone who might want to hire you. So what makes you a cool team? Why would someone want to work with you? What stuff have you worked on? How many games have you worked on? How complicated were they? What kind of experience do you bring to bear? Do you have any tools or processes or philosophies that you've applied to your own projects that you could then apply to a client's work and help them be successful? So what's your origin story as a contract team? And once you've answered some of those foundational questions, the next thing you have to figure out is codify what you're selling, right? So, are you looking to market yourselves as a team that can take on an entire game, or are you more interested in taking on parts or pieces of a game, like tools dev, live ops, feature development, QA, any one of the 1,000 things that go into making a game? So, do you want short-term work or long-term work? So these are all questions that you have to answer, and once you kind of know who you are as a team and what you're selling, that's going to help to inform who your potential clients are. Now, when I'm actually pitching my team, I position us in the following way. So we're a bunch of AAA vets. It's me, I'm a AAA producer, and my team are a bunch of AAA engineers. And so we're pretty experienced and we're pretty bomb-proof temperament-wise because we've been through the wars. So the way I often describe us to clients is we're like an engineering SEAL team, in that you can actually drop us into any situation, doesn't matter how crazy it is, bombs could be going off, shrapnel flying everywhere, and we will very calmly be able to go into the situation, assess what's going on, come up with a plan, and then execute against that plan. And we've actually, in the course of our time consulting, we've had to take on some really crazy projects, really high pressure, high stakes, tight timelines, and we have a 100% track record of delivering on time and on budget. So we're kind of known in the industry as being a high performance, low drama team. So because I have that really clear understanding of who we are, that naturally kind of informs what kind of clients might be interested in working with us, right? They tend to be larger companies that need some flexibility in their technical resourcing. They need senior people to make their problems go away without a lot of hand-holding, and so that's what we do. Now, I imagine a lot of you, if you've got an indie team where you've got a bunch of designers and artists and as well as programmers, you might be thinking that doesn't resonate with me at all. So let me give you another example that I think is really interesting. I mentor a lot of teams all over the place, and one of my favorites is a team in Australia called Harmonious Games, and I don't know if you've heard of them. They're a great bunch of people, and they made a really cool game a couple years ago that did pretty well on the Switch. It was called Putty Pals, and it's a co-op platformer where you have to work together with another player to navigate the world and solve problems. And I thought it was just a pretty legit, fun game, but what I didn't know about it, and I had known these guys for a long time before they told me this, that Putty Pals isn't just a fun game. It was actually designed based on the principles of promoting the emotional intelligence of their players. The designer actually studied psychology, and she was really interested to figure out how games could accomplish that goal. And so I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. I can see that because you do have to work pretty closely together with another player under stressful circumstances. And so they then proceeded to tell me that one of their former college professors at one point approached them and said, you know, this whole thing you've done with Putty Pals, the design based on emotional intelligence, is really interesting. And there's a study going on in the Australian penal system, and they want to understand how technology and games could potentially be used to increase the communication skills to improve the communication skills of the inmate population. And we think Putty Pals could be a great pilot. So they're like, great, sure. So they gave these researchers an early version of Putty Pals. They put it in the hands of hardcore felons, and over the course of the study, they found that this game actually did increase the EQ of the inmates. They were able to communicate more effectively under stressful circumstances. And when they told me this, I'm like, holy crap, that is so interesting. And this was in the context of talking with them about where they could focus their biz dev efforts for doing some contract work. And I'm like, I can't believe I didn't know this before, because your clients aren't just game industry people or game companies. Your clients are anybody who might be interested in understanding how a game or technology could be used to positively impact people's behavior. So I tell you this for one very important reason, and that is that often there's this idea that as indies, we're all competing for the same small number of jobs. So it promotes this idea that there's just a lot of scarcity in the industry. And that's why going through this process and being clear on who you are and what skills and resources you bring to bear actually goes a long way towards opening up new potential avenues for work, because the skills that you have in making games can be used to solve other problems. And so that's what the Harmonious team did. And they're actually having some interesting luck pursuing academic work and government grants, as well as game companies. Marco Rubio mouth, sorry. So last piece of the puzzle here, in addition to kind of figuring out who you are, who your clients might be, what you're selling, is figuring out what you should charge. And this is a hard one, because quite frankly, most of you should probably charge different rates based on your relative experience. So if you want a range, I would say that the range at the low end for dealing with corporate clients would be, if you're an inexperienced team, maybe 40 an hour. And that can go up to over 200 an hour. But the average, what most contract clients will probably pay, is between 60 and 100. That's an average. But in terms of figuring out what you and your team should charge, that's going to be based on stuff that's individual to you all. So again, skills and experience, how many games you've worked on, years in the industry, how complex the games were that you've worked on as a team. You probably want to have a range of costs, by the way, depending on the kinds of projects. If you want to take on crazy firefighting projects like we do, you can potentially charge a little more for those sometimes than longer term work. Your geographical location can also impact what you can charge, right? Because certain markets will pay more than others. But I think one of the most important things in determining what you should charge is what your goals are. So I think that's a good point to segue into our next section. We've talked about who you are, now let's talk about what you want. And I imagine most of you probably want money. Whenever I start working with a team I'm mentoring, that's what they always say when I say, what do you want out of this? They'll say money. If I'm not working on my own games, I just want to make as much as possible. And I totally get that. I've been in that position. That makes perfect sense to me. But I would also say this. Sometimes we do ourselves a big disservice by thinking as indies, money is the only thing we should care about when we're doing contract work. Because there's a lot of other stuff that might be equally, if not more important to you when push comes to shove. Like the kinds of projects you want to work on. I think it's really important to not only know what kinds of projects you want to work on, whether it's genre or platform, but you also need to know what you don't want to work on, right? Because that's going to help to inform your biz dev efforts. And also, if a project comes your way that you think is really cool and interesting, you might be willing to take a little less money if that makes sense at the time for you as a team. Another often really underlooked or undervalued upside of doing contract work is experience. We do a lot of co-development with incredibly amazing world-class companies, and every single time we do a project with them, we learn something that potentially makes us better when we're developing our own indie projects. So focusing your biz dev efforts on working with a company that could teach you something that you might need to learn is also a really good thing. Now, I have credit listed on here as well, and I want to note this because if you've never been through the process of negotiating a contract with a corporate client, it's easy to assume that, oh, this will be great because I can actually put something up on my website and talk about the work I've done with these clients, and it was a really cool gig, and I can use that to promote myself. And what you should be aware of is that a lot of corporate contracts have boilerplate language in them that says that you're not allowed to talk about anything related to the project you worked on unless the client gives you their express written permission. And in some really extreme cases, they'll tell you you can't even mention that you worked with the client themselves by name. So if that's something that you feel is going to be really important to getting more work going forward, that's a point you probably have to negotiate for. And so sometimes that can involve giving a client a break on the rate. Sometimes you negotiate for something else. You throw in something else that they might actually want or appreciate to get them to agree to that. Autonomy is also a really big deal, right? Because I think one of the best parts of being an indie is feeling like you have some kind of control over your destiny. And in my experience, autonomy kind of comes in two forms: creative and operational. So creative autonomy means you have a lot of say over what you're making, and operational autonomy means you have say over how you're going to make it, how you run your team, how you run your company, how you run the project. And so if having a lot of autonomy and control is really important to you, then you might want to actually look for projects that are those kind of self-contained ones where you're taking on development of a project from beginning to end. Because in my experience, you don't have quite as much client contact on those. You meet with them a lot in the beginning, you check in periodically at key milestone points, and then you hand it off in the end and you're done. That's a really different situation than co-development, where you literally take members of your team and you plug them into an existing client project structure to give them some flexible resourcing. So you walk in, you check your ego at the door, and you basically say, I'm here to do whatever you need me to do. Scenario one, lots of control. Scenario two, not so much. Guess which one pays more? The one where you have less control. So if control is important to you, you got to recognize that up front. Stability is another one. Like understanding what your tolerance for stability and risk is another key thing when you start to do biz dev. I cannot tell you the number of people over time who have come to me and basically said, oh, I've got this really cool opportunity. If you work for us for free or a really drastically reduced rate, you can get on the ground floor of this cool tech idea I have. And I don't know about you. If I'm going to take a risk, I'm going to risk stuff on my own project, not on someone else's, ever. So if you don't have a high tolerance for risk, you're going to want to look for companies that have, they're stable, they're well-funded, they can pay you on time, and they can pay you on your terms. By terms, I mean net 30. And net 30 means you will be paid 30 days after they receive the invoice. And it's also worth noting that a lot of corporate clients in their contracts, they'll have standard terms being net 60 or net 90. And that's a thing that you can negotiate for. That's a really easy point of negotiation. I have never had a client say, nope, we will not pay you on net 30 terms. Because all you have to do is explain, we're a tiny indie studio, and for cash flow reasons, we need you to pay us sooner than that. And it's often literally just that simple. Now, it's entirely possible that you're going to find a cool project that's going to come your way that meets a lot of these goals. It's interesting, your team wants to work on it, it potentially can give you some experience that'll help you be good at developing your own games, but the client just doesn't have enough budget to pay you your rates. So how do you handle that? Well, you can certainly just say, okay, I'm going to give you the lower rate and just kind of forget about it. But there's a more productive way of handling that, which I highly recommend, which is applying a formal sales discount. So sales discounts is exactly what it sounds like. You're agreeing to give the client a reduced rate for the duration of a single project. And I've found that these are really effective as long as they're visible. So for the first time in a really long time, I gave a sales discount to a client because it was really interesting work. And so every month when I invoice them, I have 3 line items on the invoice. The top line is how much I would have charged if I was charging my full rate. Bottom line is what I agreed to charge them. And in the middle, I subtract the difference between the two, and I have a sales discount, and that's an actual dollar figure that the client sees every month. Now you might think, well, that's a lot of extra work. Why would you do that? Well, because it codifies my investment in the project, and it makes it much easier for me to have a hard conversation with a client down the line. If they want to keep working with us for another phase of the project, I can say, look at how much money I've invested in this project. So this is below our normal rate, and I'd like to figure out a way to get closer to what I would normally charge. And if you can't do that, then let's figure out some other way that we might be able to come up with an equitable situation. So sales discounts are your friend. Use them. Okay, so I can go on and on. I'm running a little late on time here. So let me move on to the third item on my list, my original list, which is understanding what your options are. Now, here I'm talking about something very specific, and that is, again, how you structure projects around compensation. This goes back to what I said in the beginning about asking people how they did that, and hearing over and over again that the only option for games was fixed bid. And I didn't find that especially good news at the time because I don't think fixed bids are a good model for games at all. I'll explain why in a minute, but I'm quite serious. I don't think it's an ideal model for the games industry. And I also wasn't happy to hear that at the time because I feel like whenever anyone says there's only one way to do something, if the minute you accept that that's true, you stop looking for other options, and there actually are some really good options out there that are not only good for you, but they're also good for the client as well. But before I get into that, do you guys know what a fixed bid is? Have you heard of that term? It's basically like it's a contractual agreement to make a thing and charge a set amount of money for that thing, and you deliver it within a specific time period. So the secret of the fixed bid project is just a shit ton of planning goes into making those successful. You have to be very, very careful in how you plan a fixed bid project. You have to come in with an airtight scope, a lot of documentation, detailed milestone deliverables with also equally detailed tasks associated with each one. And the reason why you have to have all that is in preparation for that inevitable moment when the client says to you, I'm pretty sure that was supposed to be in scope. And that's going to happen every time on every project. And I gotta say, clients aren't evil when they do that. It is their job to try and get as much as they possibly can and get the best possible thing from anyone that they work with. But ideally, you don't want to have to do that at your expense, right? So you have to be prepared with some kind of argument that says, no, as you can see, clearly that's not part of scope, but I can actually give you a change order, and I'd be happy to do it for X amount more money. So yeah, fixed bids, they're a little bit tricky. And I gotta say, I spent a little bit of time outside of games several years ago working for companies that did work for hire in web app and software development, so just straight tech projects. And I gotta say, I think tech projects compared to games are just so much more simple, because your ability to be successful on those kinds of projects are based on 3 things and 3 things only. Is it on time? Is it on budget? Did you nail your scope? And if you can say yes, yes, and yes, you're good, you're done. You were successful in running that project. But with games, we have this 4th factor of, is it fun? And as we all know, fun is really hard to schedule for sometimes, right? Like sometimes a project, to just really nail your core game loop, it requires a lot more iteration than you expected. Or maybe it requires a lot of collaboration. And iteration and collaboration and fixed bids are just antithetical to each other. They are absolutely functioning at cross purposes. And by the way, if anyone ever comes to you and says, hey, I love working with give me a fixed bid, and by the way, I love working with my vendors in a really collaborative way, the answer should just be, nope, that's not gonna work out well. And if someone says, hey, I wanna do a fixed bid project with you, but we also, we do agile development, the answer is, hell nope, no. Do not do that. That's not going to work out well for you. So obviously, it's not easy to plan every project perfectly, because sometimes the clients themselves don't know exactly what they're going to need from you. So for clients that need more flexibility and they want to collaborate, obviously a fixed bid's a bad option. So there is a second option, and that's time and materials. Basically, a time and materials project, think of it as just an hourly engagement where you're selling your time to a client by the hour. So you basically come in and say, my rate is X. I have Y number of people coming on the project, so we're just going to keep billing until the job is done. And it's good. That's good for you because you're going to get paid for every hour that you work. And it's good for the clients because it does give them some flexibility, but it's also not so great for the clients because it kind of makes them feel like they're signing up to hand you a blank check, right? Like, I'm in the middle of getting my porch rebuilt, and I've been interviewing contractors, and I have to say, if one of them turned up and said, I don't really know how long this is gonna take or what materials I'm gonna need, but I'm just gonna show up with my crew on Monday and we're just gonna start doing stuff and I'm gonna hand you an invoice when this is over, I'd be like, oh my God, that sounds terrifying, never. And so, clients often feel the same. But there is actually a third option, and that is called time and materials not to exceed. And this is something that is much better known in tech consulting circles, but not so much in games, and I would really love to see this change because this is, I think, a much better model for our industry. So this is kind of like a tweener between time and materials and fixed bids, right? So you go in and you start it off like you would a fixed bid project. You understand what the client is trying to achieve. You do your due diligence. You go off and you plan and say, I think that we're going to need X number of people for X number of time, and it's going to cost this much. And you basically say, here is my rough plan of how I'm going to attack this problem. But this is where it diverges from a fixed bid. Because instead of committing to a very specific set of deliverables and a specific scope, you're basically committing to keep within your price range and work with the client on an ongoing flexible basis. So with us, when we do these kinds of projects, we sit down with the clients every week and we say, here's where we're tracking against our original plan. Do you feel like we need to change course? If we feel that the project needs to change course, we'll make some recommendations. Then we sit down and work with the client to figure out what the impact of that will be. So if it's going to take more time or more budget, and they don't have that, then we will sit back down with them and say, okay, well, let's figure out how we can reduce scope to get you to the closest point of what you actually need for the money that you actually have. So time materials NTE is a great model. Again, if you have any questions about how to potentially sell this into your teams or your clients, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you because I would love to see this be more pervasive. I think it's really good for all of us. And I am almost running out of time. So I've got one last section to cover, and that is the stuff you need to put in place to be successful. So we've talked about who you are, what you want, what's possible. Now let's talk about all the things you need to do to make sure you're successful. And I saved the worst for last because I know saying this stuff in front of a room full of indies, you're going to hate everything I'm about to say. So brace yourselves. If you're going to do these kinds of projects, I'm sorry, you're going to probably have to implement some timesheets. And it's a really hard transition. Your team will hate you. They'll be super angry because there's a big difference between being free and easy indies and being consultants that have to keep track of their hours. But you still got to do it. If you're doing any kind of time and materials work, you have to be pretty scrupulous about what you charge. If you charge 38.25 hours, that's all you can, if that's how long you spent, that's all you can bill for. You don't bill for 40 like you would on a fixed bid. So necessary for time materials, but also really important for fixed bids as well, because I know quite a few indies that have taken on fully self-contained projects, and they end up underbidding the work and working 60, 70 hours a week to actually make up for it. And so it's really important to understand where your time is going, so the next time you take on a project like that, you can actually understand how long things actually take. So it's going to help you to improve your bidding skills and abilities. So another thing that I highly recommend is that you get a project manager, and I know many of you are probably inwardly groaning going, we can barely feed ourselves, we can't take on another person. And it's easy to see how taking on a project manager would feel like another mouth to feed, but I will say this, when you're doing consulting projects, a project manager is not a cost center, it's a revenue generator. You actually bill for their time as you would anyone else on your team. And project managers, I find, are really good to have on the team, especially when you have a team that's not happy about doing consulting projects. And I think one of the reasons why people feel unhappy about doing consulting, aside from all the obvious, is they feel like they have to spend time doing things they don't like to do, like managing projects and handling clients. So it's a lot better if you can just let your team be good at what they're doing, good at what they do, and let someone else handle all the tedious project management and managing client expectations. And managing client expectations is a huge part of being successful when you do any kind of consulting. Which brings me to my next thing. Whether you have a project manager or not, unfortunately, you gotta do status reports when you do this kind of work, because I'm a big believer in nothing should ever be an unhappy surprise for your clients, well, or for you, for that matter. And so doing status reports is a really great way of heading those potential unhappy surprises off at the pass. Now, I don't, obviously, because I'm out of time, I don't have a lot of time to get into how you could actually use status reports to help manage client expectations, but I did do a talk at GDC a couple years ago called Up Shit Creek, Managing the Unmanageable Project, and GDC just put it up on their YouTube channel for free, so about a third of the way through, I spent a lot of time talking about managing expectations on really difficult projects, and so there's a bunch of potentially useful information in there about how to use status reports to keep the clients happy. And last but not least, this is another thing that goes against the grain for a lot of indies, but you probably need to get an attorney if you're taking on any kind of contract work where you have a client giving you a legal agreement and asking you to sign it. And if you are actually going to take on an attorney, I would highly recommend you find someone who's actually indie friendly, and there are several out there, because their job is to actually make you smarter. Their job isn't to negotiate the contract for you. That's not what they're there for. They're there to make you smarter, help you to understand how to make smart choices based on the information you have in front of you, and to show you where there's potential to negotiate, which is not always obvious to all of us if we haven't gone through that process. So if you're interested in finding a good attorney, I can certainly recommend ours, or I might be able to point you in some other directions from some other attorneys that I know that work with indies, but definitely get one. It'll change your life. It's worth doing. And one final thought I want to leave you with. So we're here at GDC this week, and this is a time where a lot of people are going to be looking for work and be really stressed out and steeped in that idea of scarcity. There's not enough good to go around. There's no room to negotiate. It's hard doing this kind of work. So I just want to leave you with this one final thought. You can't allow other people's bad experiences and fear to define what's possible for you. Because the minute you accept other people's limitations as your own, you're horribly, horribly screwed. You're never going to be able to get past them. That is good advice for contracting, and it's good advice for life. So I just want to thank you all so much. And if there's anything I can do to help you, I'll be bumping around GDC this week. I'd be happy to help out, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter, unless you're trying to sell me middleware, in which case, please do not reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. But thank you so much, and I genuinely really wish you all the best. Thanks.